The lake is still black when the work begins. Before the sun touches the hills of Galilee, before the fishermen of Capernaum have said a single word to each other, two brothers are already standing knee-deep in cold water, dragging a net toward shore. Their hands are cracked from salt. Their backs ache from a night that gave them nothing. Simon and his brother Andrew have been on this water since before midnight, and the net has come up empty every single time. This is not glamorous work. It is not spiritual work. It is the same work their father did, and his father before him. Casting, waiting, hauling, mending, casting again. A few feet away, in a second boat, two more brothers are doing the same thing. James and John, sons of a man named Zebedee, sit with their hands full of wet rope, pulling torn nets across their knees, working the holes closed one thread at a time. Their father works beside them. So do the men he has hired to help. You should understand what that means. A fishing operation on the Sea of Galilee in the 1st century was not a man alone with a hand line. It required boats built from timber hauled around the lake, nets woven by skilled hands and heavy enough that torn ones could cost a full day's catch to repair, and a license from Rome just to work the water at all. Families like this one carried debt, carried employees, carried a reputation among the other fishing households in Capernaum. These 4 young men are not desperate. They are not without prospects. They have something to lose. A business, an inheritance, a future already half built for them before they were old enough to choose it. You should know that before this story goes any further, because in a few minutes, all 4 of them are going to leave it. There is a detail worth holding on to, a small one, easy to miss on a morning full of nets and rope and the ordinary business of survival. Somewhere on that shore, among the hands folding wet linen, is a hand that will one day hold a pen instead of a net. Decades from now, words written by that same hand will be translated into more languages than any other book in human history. You don't know which hand yet. Neither did he. We will get there, but not yet. This is not a story about fishing. This is not a story about 4 names on a list you memorized as a child and forgot by Monday. This is not a story about men who had nothing to lose and so had nothing to risk. This is a story about what it costs to hear a voice worth leaving everything for, and about 4 ordinary tradesmen who heard it on an ordinary morning with fish scales still on their hands, and did not stop to calculate the cost before they answered. A man is walking along the shoreline. You can hear him before you can make out his face clearly in the early light. Sandals on wet stone, a voice that carries without shouting. He has already been baptized in the Jordan by a wild-eyed prophet named John. He has already spent 40 days alone in the wilderness being tested by something ancient and hostile. He has already begun, in small towns and back rooms, to say the strangest sentence a Galilean carpenter's son could say out loud, that the kingdom of God is near. Now he is looking for the men who will carry that sentence after he is gone. He stops at the edge of the water. And what he says next will end a fishing business, break a father's heart on the spot, and start something that 2,000 years later is still spreading. One ordinary person at a time, across every continent on earth. Before Simon ever heard his own name called on that shoreline, his brother Andrew had already spent months with someone else. Andrew was the quieter of the two. History remembers Simon. Peter, the rock, the one who talks first and thinks second, the one whose name ends up on more pages of the New Testament than almost anyone else's. But Andrew was there first. Andrew was the one who found the road before his brother even knew it existed. Here's what most people miss about Andrew. Before he ever met Jesus, he was already following someone. He had left his nets once already, months earlier, to become a follower of a wilderness preacher named John, the one who ate locusts and wild honey, who baptized people in the Jordan River, who told anyone who would listen that someone greater was coming behind him. Andrew believed him, and one day, while Andrew was standing near the riverbank, John looked past the crowd at a man walking toward them and said only this, "Behold the Lamb of God." You can imagine what it does to a person to hear their teacher, the one they've staked their life on, point at someone else and essentially say, "That's the one, not me." Andrew didn't argue. He didn't ask for proof. He turned and started walking after the stranger. The Greek word used for what Andrew did next is akoloutheo, to follow. But it doesn't mean what following means today, a glance at a screen, a tap of a finger. It means to walk the same road, to become a road companion, to go where the other person goes, at the pace they go, for as long as it takes. Andrew spent that entire day with Jesus. We don't know what was said. The text doesn't record a single word of the conversation. What it records instead is what Andrew did the moment the day ended. He went and found his brother. He didn't write a letter. He didn't wait for confirmation. He found Simon, wherever Simon was. Probably back at the nets, back at the work, back at the only life either of them had ever known, and said 4 words that changed the rest of both their lives. "We have found the Messiah." Stay with me here, because this matters more than it looks like it does. Andrew is never going to be the one people remember first. He is not going to preach the sermon at Pentecost. He is not going to write a gospel. He is not going to be the rock the church is built on. But without Andrew, there is no Simon Peter standing on that stage at all. Andrew's entire role, every time his name appears in the story, is the same. He finds someone and brings them to Jesus, a brother, a boy with 5 loaves and 2 fish, some Greeks looking for an audience. Andrew never headlines. Andrew always introduces. And if you have ever felt like the person behind the person, the one who makes the connection but never gets remembered for it, you should know that Jesus needed an Andrew before he could have a Peter. Now watch what happens when the brothers meet the lake again. Sometime later. How much later? The Gospels don't agree, and it may be that this happened more than once, the story retold from different angles. Simon is back at his boat, exhausted, hauling in nets that came up empty all night. And Jesus is standing on the shore, with a crowd pressing in around him so tightly he has nowhere left to stand. He asks Simon if he can borrow the boat. Just push out a little from shore. Just enough water between them and the crowd. Simon agrees, probably out of politeness more than anything else. This is, after all, the man his brother has been talking about for weeks. And then Jesus tells him to push out further, into the deep water, and let down the nets. You have to understand what this request actually is, coming from a carpenter to a man who has fished this lake his entire life. Simon knows the water. Simon knows the fish don't come up from the deep in daylight. Simon knows this is not how it works. And you can hear the exhaustion and the mild condescension in his answer. "Master, we have toiled all night and have taken nothing." A pause. And then, "Nevertheless, at thy word I will let down the net." The nets come up so full they begin to break. Simon has to call for the other boat, James and John's boat, to come and help. And even with both boats working together, the catch is so heavy that the boats begin to sink under the weight of it. And here is where Simon Peter does something almost nobody expects from a man who has just witnessed a miracle that will make him wealthy. He doesn't celebrate. He doesn't calculate the profit. He falls down. Right there, in a boat full of fish, on his knees in the mess and the scales and the water, And he says words that sound less like gratitude and more like fear. "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." This is the part nobody tells you about the calling of Peter. It isn't a hero's welcome. It's a confession. Before Simon becomes Peter, before he becomes the Rock, before his name changes, before 3,000 people are baptized because of a sermon he preaches, he is, for one unguarded moment, a man overwhelmed by his own smallness in front of something holy. He doesn't ask to follow. He asks to be left alone, because he doesn't believe he deserves what's happening to him. If you have ever felt too unworthy for the very thing you were hoping for, you are standing exactly where Simon stood. And Jesus' answer is the same 4 words, spoken a different way. "Fear not. From henceforth thou shalt catch men." Not, "You're good enough." Not, "You've earned this." Just, "Fear not. Come anyway." Simon and Andrew pull the boats up onto the beach, and they leave everything. Not just the nets this time. The catch of a lifetime, still flopping in the bottom of the boat, still worth more money than either of them has ever held at once. And they walk away from it without looking back. 2 brothers, 2 nets, 1 voice on a shoreline that neither of them saw coming. That's the first half of this story. The half where following costs a fishing business and a lifetime's catch left rotting on a beach. But there's a second boat in this story. And in that boat is a father who is about to watch both of his sons walk away from him without a single word of explanation. Before we get there, if this is the kind of video that means something to you, the kind that makes you wonder what you'd leave behind if the same voice called your name, hit subscribe now. And tell me in the comments, of the 2 brothers so far, which calling hit you harder? Andrew's quiet, "We have found him," or Peter falling to his knees in a boat full of fish? Now, back to the water. Because it's about to get a lot more complicated. Zebedee is still standing in the boat when it happens. He is an older man, established enough in the fishing trade to have hired help. The text mentions them plainly, men working alongside his sons, which tells you something important about this family before the story even continues. This was not a struggling household living hand to mouth. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, who wrote extensively about first-century life around the Sea of Galilee, fishing on these waters was a licensed and taxed profession. It required capital for boats and nets, permits from Rome, and enough steady income to employ outside labor. Zebedee's sons were not walking away from nothing. They were walking away from security, from an inheritance, from a business their father had likely spent decades building so that one day it would belong to them. James is the elder of the 2 brothers. John is younger. And if you are picturing the John from later in this channel's videos, the frail old man exiled to a volcanic rock called Patmos, writing visions so strange they've been debated for 2,000 years, stop. Erase that image completely. This John is a teenager, maybe barely into his 20s. He has never seen a vision. He has never been imprisoned. He has never written a word of scripture in his life. Right now, he is a hot-tempered young fisherman with wet rope in his hands, standing in a boat next to his older brother and his father, mending torn nets under the same gray morning sky. Jesus calls them the same way he called Simon and Andrew. Walking, stopping, speaking. And the response is identical in its suddenness. James and John leave the boat. But watch this detail closely, because it's the one the gospel writers chose to include on purpose. They don't just leave the nets. They leave their father standing there. You can build the scene yourself. One of the hired hands is still holding a half-mended net when it happens, thread pulled halfway through a torn seam, hands frozen mid-motion, not sure whether to keep working or wait for someone to tell him what happens now. An old man, alone in a half-mended boat, watching both of his sons walk down the beach after a stranger, without so much as an explanation shouted back over their shoulders. No apprentice to replace them. No plan for who inherits the business now. Just an empty stretch of water, a hired hand who doesn't know what to do with his hands, and a father left holding a net that will now take twice as long to mend with half the help he had an hour ago. This is grief hiding inside a calling. Nobody talks about Zebedee. He gets one sentence in the whole New Testament, and then he disappears from the story entirely. But somebody had to feel what he felt that morning. And if you have ever been the parent left, standing on a beach, watching a child choose a road you didn't choose for them, a road you don't understand, a road that might mean you see them once a year if you're lucky, you already know exactly what was in that silence. But it gets stranger. Because James and John, it turns out, did not leave their old selves in the boat along with their father. They brought their temper with them. Later, much later, well into the years they spend traveling with Jesus, the two brothers earn themselves a nickname. Jesus himself gives it to them, and it's recorded in the Greek as Boanerges, a transliteration of an Aramaic phrase meaning sons of thunder. You don't get a nickname like that for being calm. Here's the story that earns it. Jesus and his followers are traveling through Samaritan territory. Hostile territory, since Jews and Samaritans had despised each other for centuries over questions of worship and bloodline and who really belonged to the people of God. A Samaritan village refuses to let them stay the night, simply because they're heading toward Jerusalem. It's an insult, but a small one. The kind of small insult that happens on every long journey, the kind you or I might mutter about and forget by the next town. James and John's response is not small at all. Lord, they ask, wilt thou that we command fire to come down from heaven and consume them? Sit with that for a second. These are not villains asking this question. These are two of the men who will become foundational leaders of the early church. James will become the first of the 12 to be martyred, beheaded on the order of Herod Agrippa I, a death the historian Eusebius later records in his account of the early church. John will go on to write a gospel built almost entirely around the theme of love. But right here, in this moment, on this road, they are asking their teacher for permission to burn an entire village to the ground over a bruised ego. If you have ever wanted to watch something burn over an insult you knew, deep down, wasn't worth the anger you were giving it, you already understand exactly what was happening in that boat's worth of temper on that road. Pay attention to this, because it's the hinge the whole video turns on. Jesus doesn't grant the request. He doesn't even entertain it. He turns and rebukes them, sharply enough that Luke bothers to record it, and they simply walk on to the next village instead. Fire withheld, village spared, two brothers corrected in front of the others, and the journey continues as if nothing happened. There's one more thing worth noticing here, something easy to skip past if you're only listening for the dramatic parts. The same hands that wanted to call down fire on strangers are the same hands that, years later, someone will describe leaning against Jesus' chest at the Last Supper, the disciple whom Jesus loved, resting close enough to hear a heartbeat. Whether you leave people the way you found them is never up to how they started. It's up to what happens between the calling and the ending. James and John did not walk away from that lake as finished men. They walked away as raw material, thunder that hadn't yet been shaped into anything. Hold that thought. Because we haven't even gotten to the fifth man yet, the one who almost didn't believe any of this was real. The fifth man in this story almost said no. His name is Philip, and he comes from the same town as Peter and Andrew, a fishing village called Bethsaida, which tells you something about how small this whole movement still is at this point. These are not men gathered from across the empire. They are neighbors. Men who probably recognized each other's faces at the market before any of this began. Jesus finds Philip the way he found the others, directly, without introduction, without warning. "Follow me." And Philip does. But what Philip does next is the part worth slowing down for. He doesn't run to a brother, the way Andrew did. He runs to a friend, a man named Nathanael, from the town of Cana, who most historians and Bible scholars believe is the same person the other Gospels call Bartholomew. And Philip says almost exactly what Andrew said. "We have found him, of whom Moses, in the law, and the prophets, did write, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." Nathanael's answer is not what you'd expect from someone about to become one of the 12. Can there any good thing come out of Nazareth? You have to understand what an insult this actually is. Nazareth was a nowhere town, small, poor, with a population historians estimate at only a few hundred people. The kind of place with no mention anywhere in the Hebrew Scriptures, no prophecy attached to it, no reputation at all except perhaps a bad one among its slightly larger neighbors. Nathanael isn't being cruel for the sake of it. He's being honest. He's saying what half of Galilee is probably thinking and nobody else has said out loud yet. Nothing important comes from a place like that. And Philip doesn't argue with him. He doesn't build a case. He doesn't quote a single verse of prophecy back at his skeptical friend. He says two words that might be the most underrated piece of advice in the entire Bible. Come and see. Not trust me. Not let me convince you. Just come look for yourself. Nathanael goes. You can imagine the walk itself, the silence between two friends. One of them still half convinced this is a waste of an afternoon, the other one certain enough to have already dropped everything for it. And what happens next is the reason this reluctant, skeptical man ends up giving one of the most immediate confessions of faith in the entire Gospel of John. As Nathanael approaches, before a single word has passed between them, Jesus says, "Behold an Israelite indeed, in whom is no guile." The Greek word behind no guile is built from doulos, deceit, trickery, the kind of bait used to trap something. Negated, it becomes a description of a man with nothing hidden, nothing false, no hook concealed beneath the surface. And there's a quiet irony worth noticing here, one the original audience would have caught immediately. These were fishermen. Their entire trade was built on deception, the right lure, the right bait, tricking a fish into believing something false long enough to catch it. And here is a man being commended, by name, for having none of that in him at all. No hook, no hidden trap, just an honest question asked out loud on a hillside. Nathanael is stunned. "Whence knowest thou me? How do you know anything about me at all?" And Jesus answers with a detail so small and so specific that it stops being about theology and becomes about being truly seen. "Before that Philip called thee, when thou wast under the fig tree, I saw thee." We don't know exactly what Nathanael was doing under that fig tree. Praying, maybe. Studying the Scriptures alone, the way devout men often did in the shade, away from the noise of the village. Maybe wrestling with a private doubt he'd never said out loud to anyone, not even Philip. Whatever it was private. It was unwitnessed by any other human being. And Jesus saw it anyway. You can watch the exact moment the skepticism breaks. It isn't gradual. It isn't a slow accumulation of evidence. It's instant, and it's total. One sentence about a tree nobody else knew he'd been sitting under, and the man who moments earlier had openly mocked Nazareth says the most direct confession of faith spoken by anyone in this entire story. "Rabbi, thou art the Son of God. Thou art the King of Israel." From, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" to that, in the space of a single conversation. Now, Remember the detail we planted at the very beginning of this video. A hand among the nets on that shoreline, one that would one day hold a pen instead of a rope. We're ready to name it now. It's John's. The same young man who stood in a boat and asked Jesus for permission to burn a Samaritan village to the ground. The same hot-tempered teenager nicknamed Son of Thunder for a reason. That same hand, decades later, after everything this story hasn't even reached yet, after a cross and an empty tomb and a lifetime of preaching, is the hand that will write a gospel almost entirely organized around a single word: love. God is love, he will write, in a letter still read in churches every single week, nearly 2,000 years after he wrote it. The same man who wanted fire from heaven becomes the disciple most remembered for describing what it means to lay down your life for someone else. Nobody looking at that boat on that gray morning could have predicted that. Not Zebedee, standing alone with his nets. Not the hired hand, still holding his half-mended thread. Not the other young men watching two of their neighbors walk away without explanation. Certainly not John himself, who at that point had no idea he was thunder that hadn't yet been shaped into anything. And maybe that's the part of this story that reaches furthest into your own life. Whoever you are, however long it's been since anyone called your name toward something you didn't fully understand. Almost everyone, at some point, has stood at the edge of a known and steady life. A job, a hometown, a path their family expected of them, and felt something call them toward an uncertain road instead. You don't get to see, in that moment, who you'll become 20 or 30 years down that road. Zebedee's sons certainly didn't. All any of them had, standing on that beach, was a voice worth leaving the boat for, and the courage to answer before they'd calculated the cost. That's the thread running underneath all 5 of these callings. Not one of them heard a fully formed plan. Not one of them was told what they'd become. They were only ever given a single word, spoken directly to them, in the middle of an ordinary task, and the choice of whether to put down what was in their hands. So what do you do with 5 ordinary men, a beach full of abandoned nets, and one father left standing alone in a boat? You start by admitting this is not a story about extraordinary people who were chosen because they deserved it. This is not a story about spiritual giants who had it figured out before anyone called their name. This is not a story about men who had nothing to lose and so risked nothing at all. This is a story about tradesmen, fishermen with salt-cracked hands, a temper that wanted to burn a village down, a skeptic who nearly walked away before he'd even arrived, and what happened when an ordinary Tuesday morning turned into the most important decision any of them would ever make. Here's the first thing worth carrying with you. None of these 5 men were chosen for status, wealth, education, or religious credentials. Peter and Andrew smelled like the lake. James and John had a temper problem serious enough to earn them a nickname about fire. Philip was practical to the point of caution, and Nathanael openly doubted the whole thing before he'd taken a single step toward it. If you have ever felt too ordinary, too flawed, too unqualified for whatever it is you sense you're being called toward, you are in exactly the company these 5 men kept. Here's the second thing. The call never came at a mountaintop, in a temple, during a moment of quiet reflection when everyone had time to think it through. It came in the middle of the work. Mending nets. Hauling in an empty catch after a long, discouraging night. Standing beside a father who needed the help. You should notice that, because it means the same is probably true for you. Whatever is calling you toward something bigger than your ordinary Tuesday is far more likely to interrupt your work than to wait for you to finish it. And here's the third thing, the one that should sit with you the longest. Somewhere on that beach, that morning, There were nets nobody ever picked back up. A boat that stayed a little emptier than it used to be. A father who had to explain to his hired hands why his sons weren't coming back. Following cost something real for every single one of these men. Not a symbolic sacrifice, but an actual business, an actual inheritance, an actual relationship with a father who was left standing in the water without so much as a goodbye. The nets are still on that shore, in a sense, somewhere. The question this leaves you with is never really whether a voice is calling. It's whether you're willing to leave what's currently in your hands. So tell me, if that same voice interrupted your ordinary Tuesday, mid-task, exactly the way it interrupted theirs, what would be in your hands that you'd have to put down? Write it in the comments. I read every one. We've only covered 5 of the 12. There are still 6 more men waiting in this story. A tax collector everyone in his town despised. A doubter whose name became shorthand for skepticism itself. A revolutionary who once would have killed a man like Matthew on sight. And one disciple whose name has become the only synonym for betrayal the English language has ever needed. That's part 2. But for tonight, picture the beach one more time. The nets, half-mended, left in the sand. The boat, rocking empty in the shallows. And 5 sets of footprints walking away from everything they knew, toward something none of them could have explained yet, and none of them would ever regret.